Young George Washington by James Baldwin. When George Washington was a boy in Virginia, once every summer a ship came up the river to the plantation. It had come across the sea from far away England, and it brought many things for those who were rich enough to pay for them. It brought bonnets and pretty dresses for George's mother and sisters. It brought perhaps a hat and a tailor-made suit for himself. It brought tools and furniture, and once a yellow coach that had been made in London for his brother. When all these things had been taken ashore, the ship would hoist her sails and go farther up the river to leave goods at another plantation. In a few weeks it would come back and be moored again at the same place. Then there was a busy time on shore. The tobacco that had been raised during the last year must be carried on shipboard to be taken to the great tobacco markets in England. The slaves on the plantation were running back and forth, rolling barrels and carrying bales of tobacco down to the landing. Letters were written to friends in England, and orders were made out for the goods that were to be brought back next year. But in a day or two all this stir was over. The sails were again spread, and the ship glided away on its long voyage across the sea. George had seen this ship coming and going every year since he could remember. He must have thought how pleasant it would be to sail away to foreign lands and see the many wonderful things that are there. And then, like many another active boy, he began to grow tired of the quiet life on the farm and wished that he might be a sailor. He was now about 14 years old, and his father had been dead for 3 years. His mother, with her 5 children, found it hard to work to manage her farm on the Rappahannock River and make everything come out, even at the end of each year. Was it not time that George should be earning something for himself? But what should he do? He wanted to go to sea. His elder half-brother Lawrence and even his mother thought that this might be the best thing. A bright boy like George would not long be a common sailor. He would soon make his way to a high place in the king's navy. So, at least, his friends believed. The matter was at last settled. A sea captain, who was known to the family, agreed to take George with him. He was to sail in a short time, but in the meantime a letter had come to his mother from his uncle who lived in England. "If you care for the boy's future," said the letter, "do not let him go to sea. Places in the king's navy are not easy to obtain. If he begins as a sailor, he will never be aught else." The letter convinced George's mother. It half convinced his brothers that this going to sea would be a sad mistake. But George, like other boys of his age, was headstrong. He would not listen to reason. A sailor he would be. The ship was in the river waiting for him. A boat had come to the landing to take him on board. The little chest which held his clothing had been carried down to the bank. George was in high glee at the thought of going. "Goodbye, Mother," he said. He stood on the doorstep and looked back into the house. He saw the kind faces of those whom he loved. He began to feel very sad at the thought of leaving them. "Goodbye, George." He saw the tears welling up in his mother's eyes. He knew now that she did not want him to go. He could not bear to see her grief. "Mother, I have changed my mind," he said. "I will not be a sailor. I will not leave you." Then he turned to the colored boy who was waiting by the door and said, "Run down to the landing and tell them not to put the chest on board. Tell them that I have thought differently of the matter, and that I am going to stay at home." After George Washington had changed his mind about going to sea, he studied surveying. His brother Lawrence had married and built a large house at Mount Vernon with a great porch fronting on the Potomac River. Here George went to live, for Lawrence had great love for the boy and treated him as his father would have done. At Mount Vernon, George kept on with his studies and surveying. He had a compass and surveyor's chain, and hardly a day passed that he was not out on the plantation, measuring his brother's fields. Sometimes, while he was working, a tall, white-haired gentleman would come over from Belvoir, the neighboring plantation, to talk with him. This gentleman was Sir Thomas Fairfax, who had lately come from England to look after his land in Virginia, for he was the owner of many thousands of acres among the mountains and in the wild woods. He hoped that when the land had been surveyed and some part of it laid out in farms, people might be persuaded to go there and settle. It was not long before Sir Thomas and George were the best of friends. Often they would spend the morning together, talking or surveying, and in the afternoon they would ride out with hounds, hunting foxes and making fine sport of it among the woods and hills. Sir Thomas Fairfax saw how brave his young friend was, and how exact and careful in all that he did. "Here is a boy who gives promise of great things," he said to himself. "I can trust him." Before the winter was over, he had made a bargain with his young friend to survey his lands that lie beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. George had many exciting adventures on this trip, and Sir Thomas was well pleased with his work. Through his influence, George Washington was appointed public surveyor. His experience as a surveyor in the wilderness led George into other great adventures. When he was 23, he was chosen to carry an important message to the French soldiers who were trying to get control of the Ohio River Valley. The French and Indian War came after that, and George served as a soldier. Later he became a great general in the War for Independence and helped the English colonies to become a new nation, the United States of America. He was the first president of the United States and was so well loved that it was said of him, "He was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen."